Let's talk about this picture right here. Here's a fungus, mycelium. What did we say the mycelium was? It's the fungus's body. Some hyphae from, maybe here's a fungus over here, and here's another fungus over here. We usually don't call them male and female. Usually one of them is called a plus, and one of them is called a minus, because they really don't have any parts that make them male and female. The male fungus gives out a pheromone, and guess what that does? It attracts the female. The female can't get up and walk over there, so what does she do? She starts to grow that way. Okay. So this hyphae starts to grow over, oops, put that right down. This hyphae starts to grow over this way, and eventually the red one also grows toward her, and they fuse together. The cells at the end of these hyphae fuse. That process of two cells fusing together is called plasmogamy. That's when the two cells, the cytoplasms of the two cells fuse together. Plasmus, like cytoplasm. Cytoplasms fuse together. Cytoplasms fuse. The cytoplasms of hyphae from two different cells fuse together. It's plasmogamy. So if you could see the cell, if this was the cell that we were looking at, this used to be two separate cells, but now they're fused. Here's the original nucleus from this cell, and here's the nucleus from this cell. Right now, those haven't fused together yet. So at this point, it's like one cell with what? Two nuclei. The next thing that happens, and by the way, when it's in this condition, it's said to be dikaryotic. That's a dikaryotic cell. You guys should be able to tell me what that means. Two nuclei. Right now, it's one cell, two nuclei, dikaryotic. What happens next is that we get karyogamy. You guys should be able to tell me what that means. What's kary mean? Like eukaryotes, prokaryotes. What's kary mean? Nucleus. Nucleus. And G-A-M-Y means fusing together, getting together. So karyogamy is the fusion of the nuclei. These two nuclei decide to come together. What is that sort of like that might happen in a person? When do two nuclei fuse together in a person? Through what? Yeah. Come on, guys. Easy answer. Sperm and egg. Fertilization. That's what that's like. Karyogamy is like fertilization. Two sperm, or not two sperm, that would be weird. The sperm and an egg getting together, fusing. So now, what kind of nucleus is this? Haploid plus haploid gives you diploid. This is a diploid nucleus. That diploid nucleus is then going to undergo meiosis. What do we know about meiosis and what it does to a nucleus? It takes diploid and makes haploid. But in the process of doing that, what does it do to the genes and the chromosomes? It shuffles them and mixes them up. It creates some what? Variation. So meiosis does two things here. It takes this diploid nucleus and it splits it up. But when it splits it, it creates new haploid cells, cells with different gene combinations. It mixes them up. Those haploid cells that are made become spores. Those spores then burst out of the cell, burst out of the fruiting body, land on the ground or land on some food or land in a person, and they grow. That's the fungus sexual reproduction stage. So let's walk through that again because it's sort of confusing. So we start with a mycelium of two different fungi. The male gives off a pheromone. It's irresistible to the female fungus. She grows toward it. Here comes the female. This is a hyphae from the female. She's growing over there. Here's the male. She keeps growing toward him. Eventually, he grows toward her too. Their cell membranes, their cells fuse. The cytoplasms fuse. That's plasmogamy. The cytoplasms fuse, but the nuclei haven't fused yet. So for a while, the cell is said to be dikaryotic. It's one cell with two haploid nuclei. Eventually, those nuclei come together and fuse. Haploid nucleus plus haploid nucleus gives us karyogamies. And that creates a diploid nucleus. It's like fertilization. Once that happens, we get meiosis. Meiosis takes a diploid cell, splits it back into haploid cells. But in the process of doing that, it creates some variation. We'll get to meiosis pretty soon and learn exactly how it works. But meiosis takes diploid, makes haploid, and mixes up the genes. And that's what sexual reproduction is all about, right? Mixing up genes. That creates spores. Those spores will land on some kind of substrate and germinate, grow, and become a fungus. I also want you to notice here, though, that these fungi, most of them can do both. They can do asexual and sexual. So here you can see this one, basically just the mycelium creates spores through not meiosis, but rather what? Mitosis, which is asexual. And those spores just grow, and it's just, this cycle keeps going. Which one's the fungus doing most of the time? The sexual or the asexual? The asexual. This is the fast one. This is the one that it can go and it can get on some food and it can out-reproduce everything and out-compete everything. This is the one that's doing most of the time. It does this one occasionally in order to get variation, genetic variation. Let's back up a couple slides. So this sort of puts all that in words. Plasmogamy, fusion of the cytoplasm, that should say between plus and minus hyphae. Pheromones from the male signal the female. This creates a heterokaryon. What would that mean literally? Heterokaryon. What's hetero mean? Like heterosexual, guys. What does that mean? Different, opposite, okay? Different nucleus, meaning that you have a cell with two different nuclei. That's what that means. Dikaryotic, a cell with two different nuclei. Eventually, those two nuclei fuse in a process called karyogamy, fusion of nuclei, and this creates a diploid nucleus, which undergoes meiosis, creates haploid spores with some genetic variation. Now, the fungi are grouped into several different groups, but they're grouped into clades, into groups, based on how they reproduce sexually. And we're going to talk about 5 main groups. We may add in one more later. But 5 main groups based on how they reproduce sexually. And I want to point something out to you. Notice that every one of these names has this, MYC, 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 and MYC. Anytime you see that, fungus, fungus, fungus. M, Y, and C, always fungus in biology. Now what we're going to do for the next few minutes is we're going to talk about each group, and we're going to look at some examples and talk about what makes them different from each other. But these are ascomycetes, basidiomycetes. These are called imperfect fungi, deuteromycetes. What do you think's imperfect about them? As far as scientists can tell, they don't reproduce sexually. They can't figure out how they're reproducing sexually, if they do at all. That's what's imperfect about them. Zygomycetes is another group, and Chytridiomycota is the other group. And we got slides on each one of these groups. So let's look at the next one here.